slaveholding South told a story about loyal slaves in public from the months before the war through the monuments it built afterward. And in the records examined here, the officials, patrols, and diarists of that same society spent those years behaving as though they did not believe it. Here's one of them. During the war, a prominent South Carolinian named William Henry Trescott takes to sprinkling French expressions into his conversation and explains why. He said, quote, "We are using French against Africa," end quote. He went on that the black waiters were all ears now, and that the white people needed to keep what they had to say dark. He could not, he added, afford to take them into his confidence. Litwack has that exchange from Mary Boykin Chestnut, who recorded it, who found the explanation exasperating, and who noted that Trescott had given it in French as well. He is switching languages to keep the men waiting on him from following the conversation. Nothing in the exchange says those men did anything. What it records is what Trescott assumed, that they were listening, that they understood, and that it mattered which of them heard what. And that isn't just a fact about one eccentric household. It changes how we read the faithful slave, that figure that came down to us afterward in monuments. And in July of 2023, the Florida State Board of Education approved African American history standards carrying a benchmark clarification for grades 6 through 8. That instruction includes how slaves develop skills which, in some instances, could be applied for their personal benefit. The way I was taught to read that figure, and I think it is the common way, is as a sincere memory. Mistaken maybe, but heartfelt. Trescott suggests something harder to hold. The belief and the disbelief were running at the same time, in the same society. And on the evidence I'll lay out, it was the second one that shaped what it actually did. So here's the question this episode exists to answer. If the South genuinely believed its slaves were loyal, why did it also spend those years maintaining a system of coercion built for people who were not loyal at all? 4 moves. What the South said. What its own records show it did. What was actually going on in the quarters. And a debate in the last winter of the war over whether to put muskets in the hands of the enslaved, in which a Confederate general named Howell Cobb objected in terms worth hearing exactly. The comfortable answer is that the faithful slave was propaganda. Cynical, top-down, invented to sell a war. It would be a clean story, and it would let everybody off. And the evidence does not permit a propaganda-only account. The racial doctrine underneath it was stated at the top. In March of 1861, the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, publicly called the cornerstone of the new government a great truth about black inferiority, and named slavery, in his phrase, subordination to the superior race, as the natural and normal condition of the enslaved. That's not one man's mood. That's the Confederacy's vice president, in public, characterizing what the state rests on. And if that was the ground the state stood on, then the contentment of the enslaved was the thing most likely to be offered as proof. That inference is mine, and you'll want to hold me to it. The press carried it. Litwack quotes Southern papers on the perfect order among what they called the servile classes, and a Virginian in the Confederate Congress on obedience that had never been more childlike. Afterward, the monuments went up, and some white Southerners doubted the war could have lasted more than 10 months without the faithful slave. A Florida woman recalled that her family had never really thought of these people as slaves at all, but as theirs, their own dear black folks. A woman in Richmond described hers as the keepers of everything the family did not say aloud. Recollections, which nostalgia and self-justification can shape. The vocabulary is of a piece with what the press was printing. Set that confidence next to a standing patrol system, and next to the county where a resident wrote that they had to patrol every night to keep them down. A person can sincerely believe in a benign arrangement and still keep force on hand, as insurance, or as habit. So this isn't proof of anything on its own. It is a contradiction, though, and one that size wants explaining. That's the durable thing this book is pressing on. And it didn't end in 1865. Arrangements like this one need the people living off them to believe the consent is real. You don't settle that by listening harder to these people. You settle it by watching one of them go to bed. There is a man in this chapter who boasted that the apartment where he slept went unlocked, and who confided in the same diary what he had started keeping beside the bed. Set the public record beside the private one. Not the same individuals every time, but the same society across the same 4 years. Army service drained the eligible men, and the patrols were strengthened rather than relaxed. The alarm shows up in letters reaching the governor of Mississippi. An officer in the state militia relayed a question he said came up constantly. What will become of their wives and children, left on plantations where no white man remained to keep the black population in check by fear? One resident put it plainer. Take any more men out of this county, he wrote, and they might as well hand the county over. As things stood, they were out patrolling nightly to hold people down. In wartime Savannah, a black congregation sings a hymn about all of them being free once the Lord appears. Police walk in mid-service, arrest the congregation, and allege a freedom plot, on the theory that the Lord in that refrain was a substitute for the Yankees, put there to fool whoever was listening. Maybe the police were right. Maybe they invented a cipher out of a hymn. Either way, the arrest tells us nothing about the singers and a good deal about the men who walked in. Because a society confident its slaves are content does not send officers into a church to perform textual analysis on a spiritual. What the singers meant, the white record cannot say. Somebody else has to. Then there's Edmund Ruffin, an ardent secessionist and defender of slavery. Ruffin boasted that the apartment where he slept went unlocked, and in the same diary, he admitted he'd started taking measures for defense he'd never taken before, and he specified them: keeping loaded guns by his bedside. The boast and the guns are the same man, in the same book. And then the daughter of a prominent Louisiana planter writes this: they would be helpless, she says, if the black people around them rose, with so few men left at home. And then the rest of it. They were still alive only because those people did not want to kill them. An English visitor named William Russell traveled the South in 1861, assured everywhere that these were the happiest creatures on earth, docile and passive besides. He kept noticing what didn't fit: the dejection on the faces, the curfews, the night patrols. Here's the conclusion he wrote down, and it's the sentence his hosts kept not saying. Russell wrote, quote, "There is something suspicious in the constant, never-ending statement that we are not afraid of our slaves," end quote. What he reasons from isn't the claim, it's the frequency. His inference, not a law of human behavior, and repetition can mean plenty of things. But he was there, and the thing he could not reconcile was the curfew. All of which reaches us through Litwack, and all of it from white observers and institutions: the officials, the correspondents, Trescott, the visiting Englishman. A record of what frightened slaveholders is not yet a record of anything the enslaved were doing. White fear doesn't prove black intent. Frightened people invent threats all the time. Litwack says of the wartime plots that it is often impossible to tell whether a given one was real or lived only in the imaginations of exhausted, frightened whites. And, separately, that mobs did not hesitate to hang black people accused of collaborating with the enemy. So if all we had were the patrols and the guns beside the bed, the honest conclusion would be that the South was afraid, and nothing at all about what the enslaved were actually doing or thinking. The fear would be a fact about the frightened. The other side of the record describes something else, not insurrection, information. The enslaved were running a communication network their owners couldn't see. They called it the Grapevine Telegraph, and it used code words that let people discuss forbidden things while standing in the room with the person concerned. Booker T. Washington described a post office 3 miles away where the mail carrier lingered so that news often reached black people before it reached the big house. One waiting maid couldn't read, so when her owner spelled words out, she memorized the letters and had an uncle decode them. And a Florida man named Squires Jackson, who had never let the whites know he could read, was caught mid-newspaper by his master and asked what he was up to. He flipped the paper upside down and announced the Confederate victory. His master laughed and walked out. Underneath that, there's the performance. On a Texas plantation, a white preacher told the slaves to pray for a Southern victory and asked those willing to raise their hands. One of the men there, William Adams, explained afterward that they were scared not to go along and that they surely did not want the South to win. Separately, Litwack records a man called Uncle Mac telling a story that ended with one diner quietly turning the poison tray around. That, he said, is what we slaves are going to do. Turn the tray round and pray for the North to win. About these voices. The testimony was collected in the 1930s from more than 2,000 people, most of them over 80. And among the problems Litwack raises in his preface is the biases and distortions of white interviewers. He left their spellings alone because tidying them swaps one distortion for another. That's right on the page. Read aloud, it becomes something else, so I'm not performing anyone's spelling in either direction. Here's the whole chapter in one sentence from Robert Smalls, whom Litwack calls the hero of the planter affair, and who was later elected to the South Carolina legislature and to Congress. Asked whether owners knew anything of what he called the secret life his people led, Smalls said, quote, "No, sir. One life they show their masters and another life they don't show." End quote. One life they show their masters. Not a plot, a life. Smalls isn't describing a conspiracy that could be uncovered. He's describing a partition that couldn't be crossed. And the slaveholders' entire claim to authority rested on knowing these people intimately. That is what the French was for. Not an uprising. Being known by people he had staked everything on the belief that he knew. It carries less weight than I'd like because the two records aren't independent and Litwack chose what to show. But they are differently situated, and they describe the same architecture from opposite sides, which leaves one thing unshown. I told you at the start that a Confederate general would say the quiet part out loud. He hasn't yet. And the reason he eventually does is that the South ran out of white men. Losing the war, the Confederacy turned to the unthinkable, arming the enslaved, putting muskets in the hands of the people whose devotion it had been advertising for 4 years. The debate is the hinge, because to argue it at all, you have to say out loud the thing the doctrine forbids. One Virginian objected that it would plant among them, by his own reckoning, either 250,000 black freemen, or twice that, all of them schooled in war. And then General Howell Cobb, arguing against the plan, just says it. Cobb warned, quote, "The day you make soldiers of them is the beginning of the end of the revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." End quote. He is not conceding that slavery is immoral. He is conceding something narrower and much more damaging, which is that the entire justification, the natural and normal condition, the incapacity, the cornerstone, would not survive contact with evidence. And he is saying it in the form of a warning, because he is afraid the evidence is about to arrive. You don't warn people that a test will disprove your theory unless you already suspect the result. On the 13th of March, 1865, the Confederate Congress authorized 300,000 additional troops, in the Act's own words, irrespective of color. No state was to enlist more than a quarter of its able-bodied enslaved men between 18 and 45, and the law dodged emancipation entirely, leaving that to the owners and the states. In Richmond, a company of black men in Confederate uniforms paraded the streets to attract volunteers, and John S. Wise, watching black men drill in Capitol Square, thought this was but the beginning of the end. Litwack finds that hardly any were signed up, and that apparently none of them had the opportunity to fight. The enslaved had already done that arithmetic. Told that enlisting might make him free, one man answered that the ones who fight will be free, of course. But if some of us don't fight, we'll all be free anyway. And a Virginia freedman, asked whether he would fight for his country, said he had no country. Because the answer to Cobb's question was already being delivered from the other direction, in a different uniform. Litwack's figures for the whole war: upwards of 186,000 black men in Union service. 134,111 of those signed up or conscripted inside the slave states, close to a tenth of everyone the Union enrolled. About a third of them, an estimated 68,178 men, were listed as dead and missing. Of those, 2,751 were killed in combat. For white and black troops alike, illness killed far more men than combat did. And among black soldiers, the disease death rate ran to nearly 3 times the white one. Thomas Wentworth Higginson commanded the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, a slave regiment drawn largely from Sea Island's freedmen. He arrived with what Litwack calls a condescending paternalism, thinking of these men as grown-up children, and he revised that in print. He put their advantage down to 2 things. They knew the country, which his white troops did not, and they weren't leaving home in order to go to war. They were fighting where they lived, for the people they lived with, and Higginson credited that personal purpose with the resolution and sagacity he saw in them, which explains what the Doctrine couldn't, and needs no theory of race to do it. He isn't reaching for anything essential about these men. He's pointing at their position. They were fighting where they lived, over an outcome that would decide whether they remained property. And then a private in that regiment, a man named Thomas Long, said what it was they had just done. Long said this, and I'm reading it in modern spelling throughout: with natural manhood, standing in where the transcription reads naturally manhood. Quote, if we hadn't become soldiers, all might have gone back as it was before. But now, things can never go back, because we have showed our energy and our courage and our natural manhood. End quote. A formerly enslaved private is saying why what they did will hold. And he is right, which is the part that should stop you. What I hear in it isn't a fear of losing. In the fuller passage Litwack quotes, Long worries their freedom might have slipped through the 2 houses of Congress, that Lincoln's 4 years might have passed with nothing done for them. I read him as describing freedom as something that could be granted and then quietly reversed, and as saying the uniform is what stops that. Which sets up the question: did black action track the Union Army's arrival, or did it run ahead of it? If it only followed the Army, Long was wrong about why it counted, and so am I. And here's where I want to turn against the reading this episode has probably been building in your head, because I think it's the wrong one, and the book half invites it. The comfortable version is that black resistance finally broke through, that the enslaved proved something the South didn't know, and the proving is the triumph. It's a story about a revelation. It isn't a revelation. On this evidence, nothing was demonstrated in 1863 that these people hadn't already been acting on. From the war's first months, the patrols were being reinforced, in the very period when the Army was taking away the men available to staff them. And all of that predates the Emancipation Proclamation and predates any slave regiment. And Cobb's objection doesn't read like a man learning something. It reads like a man conceding, under pressure, a thing his society's own precautions had assumed all along. If the 186,000 had demonstrated something new, the patrols would be a mystery. They're not a mystery. They're the South's working assumption, written down in advance. Long had it exactly right. These men did not change what the slaveholders knew. They made the thing impossible to walk back. The obstacle was never ignorance. So, the question, why did a South that professed its slaves were loyal also spend those years maintaining a machinery built for people who weren't? Because the profession and the machinery were never in competition. The claim lived on the surface, the working assumption underneath, and nothing forced the two to be reconciled. The patrols are the better evidence of what was actually expected, because a society under that much manpower strain kept staffing them anyway. But Litwack won't let it end as a triumph, and neither should we. Writing about this 70 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois looked at the same record and drew a conclusion about the country rather than about the soldiers. Du Bois wrote, quote, "The slave pleaded. He was humble. He protected the women of the South, and the world ignored him. The slave killed white men, and behold, he was a man." End quote. The line is usually quoted as a tribute. Read it again as an accusation, and notice who it is aimed at. Because what Du Bois is saying is that recognition was available the whole time, at a price, and the price was set by the people extending it. Pleading and protecting bought nothing. Killing was what made a man legible as a man. The most inspiring fact in this episode, and the most damning one, turn out to be the same fact, and Litwack won't let you keep the first without the second. Here's where I'll put my weight and where the argument could break. If the enslaved shaped their own freedom, then emancipation was ratified rather than granted. If the decisive variable was simply Union military capacity, then this reading is a flattering rearrangement of a story that got settled elsewhere. And the obvious test is timing. Litwack's dated cases do cut against the simplest version of the capacity story. On the Manigo rice plantations in coastal Georgia, discipline was breaking down in the war's 7th month, and Jack Savage, the head carpenter, ran in February of 1862. All of that precedes the Emancipation Proclamation. But I have to be careful about how much that buys, because the Mississippi cases attribute the collapse to white men leaving for Confederate service, and that is itself a military mechanism. So the timing evidence rebuts a narrow claim that nothing moved until the Union Army showed up. It does not on its own prove the enslaved were the decisive variable. What I can say is that the breakdown did not wait for the Army, and that it ran through openings the war created. Whether that adds up to emancipation being ratified rather than granted is the argument the rest of this book has to carry. And it hasn't carried it yet. But go back to Trescott at his table, switching languages so the men waiting on him can't follow. Everything the South would spend 4 years insisting on is already contradicted in that one small, ridiculous, frightened act. They knew. On this record, they had known the whole time. What the war changed was not what these slaveholders understood about the people they owned. It was who else was finally obliged to.